we think about equity and inclusion, making sure that we empower diverse voices on our boards and not engage in any practices around, tokenism. We have, the Black person, the Asian person, the Hispanic person. No, we want to make sure that as we bring diversity on our board, that we empower their voices as well by board leadership positions, committee chair positions, executive officer positions in terms of being on an executive committee, what have you. But we need that. In a way, you all have already talked about kind of being vulnerable and making sure that the boardroom is a safe space. Matthew and our group introduced a term he called psychological safety. How do we create more psychological safety within our boardrooms to ensure that everyone feels comfortable to say what he or she has to say? And some of the times we mentioned that can actually be invited, that contrarian opinion. If someone is sitting on the edge of their seat and wondering if they should say this, maybe even being aware with our groups and saying, who has a different opinion? Who has a contrary opinion or an idea to what we're talking about can bring some of that out. Let's not forget about all of those good practices that we use in our corporate 9-to-5 W-2 jobs. Let's bring those types of best practices that make our corporate existence and our companies function at the level of excellence we want them to function at. Let's make sure we're bringing these practices to the nonprofit world that we're in as well. And then lastly, I want to talk about this concept in terms of, we're always looking at our board competencies when we are evaluating future board members for seats. And a lot of time that generates or will revolve around a board member's or a person's ability to bring funds to our organization and to be a fundraiser or even to contribute personally. We have to recognize that may sometimes disengage a large segment of our communities and even the constituents in which we're looking to serve. So perhaps as a part of our board competencies, we need to make sure that there is a competency around being able to associate with the constituencies that we're actually serving. Is there a seat for someone in their neighborhood, a seat for someone who is actually dealing with the very issues that our nonprofit is trying to address? And another great idea that was brought up was this concept of having embedded in our boards an equity officer position, someone whose job it is to make sure that our boards are functioning in a way that are equitable and inclusive, but at the very same time, making sure that, this is another great point that was brought up by our group, making sure that role, that equity officer role, is not automatically relegated to the person of color, to the diverse person, because a lot of times we think that the Black person on our board knows everything about the entire Black community, and that's not always and pretty much always not the case. So making sure that someone is actually has a role to make sure that we are embedding equity and inclusion into our very practice. And then lastly, on the acceleration piece, we talked about measurements, which have been brought up before. I talked about that when we talked about the In the Red report. In the Red brought out the fact that we could do so much more if we had so much better data, disaggregated data around the impacts of all of these real world issues from food scarcity to education to pollution in our communities of color. So we want to be even more intentional about bringing highlight to the fact that we need to see the data. And some of our organizations would be a great place to start to begin to collect some of the data around the impact of just real world circumstances on the communities in which we serve. Lastly, I'll say as we conclude, there's probably much more activity that has gone on in the space in the last 18 months that has gone on in the last, 2 or 3 years. But how are we capturing that to make sure that we're taking advantage of this spotlight that's being placed on these issues of equity, inclusion, and fairness? I'm a firm believer that if this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, we have to take advantage of it during the lifetime of that opportunity, and the opportunity is now. And so we all sit in positions of authority on nonprofit boards where we can be impactful and bring some spotlight and attention to the issues that we're trying to resolve. And again, we know, we said earlier that some of these issues have been festering and growing for over 400 years. And to think that we're going to be able to solve them during the term of your board membership may be beyond reality. But how can we make sure that we're at least doing our part and setting it up for success for the people that are going to come behind us? I suggest to you sessions like this, where we think intentionally about how we're going about our work in the nonprofit sector, is a way, maybe not the only way, but a way to get better at this as we move forward. So hopefully we'll have more of these sessions and bring great minds together. And I know Alice is putting together a list of these recommendations, and we'll publish them in some format so that this is a space where we don't have to compete. In fact, cooperation is what allows us all to be better at what we do.